This is the Absolute Business Mindset podcast, created and hosted by Mark Hayward. This podcast will interview entrepreneurs, business owners, and people in their careers. We will delve into their journey to success, key life milestones, and go deep into their area of expertise. Get ready to learn from others' successes and failures. Today, we have Shelly O'Donovan, who is the CEO of Authentic Influence Group. Hello, Shelly. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. So let's go straight into the education piece. So you did a degree in political science. Why did you do political science?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I think in high school, I had a teacher. His name was Carl Kalenko, and we had this really unique history class in which you take an issue and you have to debate it, and you'd get graded on that debate itself. And I became really interested in politics and why certain policies were passed and why certain legislation gets passed and why certain issues never get resolved. And so I just had a really strong appetite for it. And so when I went off to college, I decided I would major in it and just dove right into that field.
Um, so I did what you would call political science degree as well, and ended up doing nothing real. Like I left and I worked in central government for oh gosh, about four years, something like that, and then went traveling and decided, look, it wasn't for me. But it's interesting. What political science gives you is, as you say, like things to be able to reason, thought processes, people, understanding why things happen, influence, and those sorts of things. What do you think your key learning skills were that you got from your degree?
From my degree, I think it was just how to really look at an issue from all different sides. And so it's easy to see something as black or white, I'm for or against it. But I think when you really delve into politics and kind of that political science degree, you have to look at it from all different angles.
Mm,
And so it gave me this ability to be able to do that and to look at things and see them in a different lens.
fantastic. So you then went and did an MPA in public administration. So we don't. Maybe we have something like that in the UK. What is public administration and how does it differ from political science?
Yeah, so it's similar to if you think about an MBA, right? That's kind of a master's in business administration. It's basically taking that and spinning it for government work or for work in that particular sector in that business or the government
Mm.
administration. So it's a little bit different because things, as you know, from working in government for a little bit, things work a little bit differently in government.
Absolutely, they really do.
They
It's
do.
it's from business. It is such a huge different. It's a
It
different
is.
mindset completely on running your own business or being in business to government. All right, so I want to we'll come very quickly on to your internships. I'm fascinated actually working with politicians. I think is really interesting. But one of the things that I asked you was, tell me something that no one else knows. And you told me that your first job at a catering company. Um, I won't kill the story out, but you started being known as the chief creative officer. Why was that?
Yes. So I very young started working in a catering company, tough job. And we would sometimes get to the halls where they were going to have these weddings or events where we were catering and it would be locked. And so, we'd be trying to call people. This was kind of pre cell phones being super big. And so we try to find a phone and call people. And it was just such a crazy thing. And eventually we just started looking for ways into the buildings. And I became known as the chief creative officer because I would always find like interesting ways into these buildings. And I'd be crawling through, crawling in the window. And it was just it's a fun time.
That sounds hilarious. Thank you for sharing that with me. So let's move on to your internship. So when you first, from what I could see from your chronology, you did your degree and then you then started working for as internships for politicians, a congressman, a state representative. What did you learn from that, from a practical pragmatic view that was different to your theory that you did in your political science degree?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think what I learned is just that politicians are people just like everyone else. I early in my career, I think it was maybe even before I started my degree, I had interned for a congressman, and everyone on his staff had a meeting. So they put me out in the front office to handle the phone, and it was like one of these really complicated phones. And he calls in on the phone, and I don't know how to work the phone, and I hung up on him. And so he calls back, and I'm mortified, right? I'm young, I'm mortified by this, and I'm so embarrassed. And he was just so gracious. He's like, I don't know how to work that phone either. Like, so I just learned early on that politicians are just regular people too. And, they're often trying to do their best, but they're in, this crazy, crazy environment trying to do that.
Yeah, I get that, and that's interesting. But did you? What I'm fascinated about, and so I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into this. Is
Yeah.
so when I did when I did my politics degree, I actually did. I specialised in international relations. That was my
Okay.
thing.
Yeah.
But I went into UK central government, and the the biggest thing for me was so it's going to be slightly different, but the civil service of it in the UK is apolitical, so that
Right.
they're implementers. They
Right.
implement policy rather than sort of devise policy, and that was an eye opener for me. And the other thing I it was the slow pace. Everything takes a long time
Yeah.
and is seriously considered from every angle before we get to a position. So for me, those sorts of experiences were like, because there would be a subcommittee and there would be a subcommittee, and do you know what I mean? It was all based
Yeah.
around having
Very
another sub of a subcommittee.
cool.
Was there something that you found that working in the front line of politics that you weren't expecting? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think just the amount of influence that you have, even as like a junior level staff person, even in those front lines. So, one of my jobs kind of later on was working in the New Jersey General Assembly, so state legislature. And, you know, there were these politicians who basically had been in their careers a long time, and they're asking me how to vote on certain pieces of legislation. And so, I'd have to put together an argument and really give them a solid reason to vote for or against it. And
Wow.
at the time, I was working on environmental policy. And, initially when I interviewed for the job, I knew there was an opening on that particular committee. And someone told me, say that you're interested in the environment. So I was like, okay. And so that's why I ended up on the environmental committee. And there's very, very particular things and lots of science involved in environmental policy and regulations. And so it was it was eye-opening for me that at a young age, I was essentially telling these older folks how to vote on a piece of legislation. So I actually had a lot of influence and didn't
Wow,
realize
that's
it at the time.
incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Having that sort of influence and persuasion. Did they ask you, were they asking from a practical point of view to keep in line with the party, or were they asking you because they actually wanted to hear your views on the subject that they were voting on?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of both. Like they definitely wanted a lot of robust, like why would you tell me to vote yay or nay on this
Mm.
thing? So, what's the reasoning behind it? And then they wanted to take that again, whatever I produced for them, whatever I put in front of them, and they were going to use it in that committee meeting or something to,
Yeah.
to stand up in favor or against a specific piece of legislation. So I was really prepping them on the back end. But again, very young, just kind of doing it on the fly and not even realizing really how much influence I was having directly on policy in New Jersey.
Wow, that's amazing. Um, so you took a role as associate director at the University of Pennsylvania Health System.
Yes.
So tell me, Tell me a little bit about that and how that was different to your earlier roles.
Yeah, so when I was in New Jersey in the state legislature, one of my last assignments was on the health committee, and so I was doing the same thing that I had done on the environment committee, but supporting health. And so just really started to enjoy working in healthcare. There's just so much, so much going on all the time, and learning about the various issues. When a lobbying role came up at Penn, I had some connections and some folks that kind of opened the door for me, and I was able to take that role. And so it was a small shop. It was basically me and a vice president who didn't even really had just a sliver of government relations in his role. And again, I was still pretty junior at that level, but learning how to influence on the state level, think about how policies were going to impact our patients, how they're going to impact the bottom line of the health system itself. And trying to really always kind of influence on that state level, and then also somewhat on the federal level as well, um, how we could move forward with the health system, how we could really support patients.
And you say that you helped shape policy and develop relationships with elected officials. So this was your first lobbying role, is
It
that right?
was, yes.
Um, so what I'm fascinated by lobbying because lobbying is slightly different in the UK. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. But so
Yeah.
what did you find about building relationships with state representatives at that time? Like maybe tell me about a policy or something that you did discuss and how you influenced as a lobbyist in your role.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would typically go up to Harrisburg, that's our state capital in Pennsylvania, and with something in hand, like so we'd be trying to pass a piece of legislation or just give our support as the health system. And I go in and I would meet with them and talk about that specific thing. So the greatest thing about lobbying for healthcare is that healthcare touches everyone.
Mm.
So often, no matter what the policy was, when I would go in and talk to a lawmaker, they would want to tell me that their mother was in the hospital with cancer and she was at Penn, like where I was a lobbyist. So that was always very helpful.
Mm.
And having, I'm a very empathetic person. So just having that empathy piece come forward too made influencing them on those policies a lot easier.
I could talk to you all day about political science in the US because it was one of the areas we spent a lot of time in. But I need to keep on track. So we're gonna move it away. Well, not totally away, but move to your GSK experience. So you worked 9 years there,
Yeah.
and you were the manager of vaccination policy. So I know you don't work for GSK now,
Yes.
but we'll talk about your role there. But so what's your view on COVID and the vaccination, like how it's been dealt with, let's say in
Yeah.
the US, with your knowledge about being in that area as a manager on vaccination?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. We've been talking about a pandemic for a long, long time. I mean, since my early career at Penn, we've talked about a pandemic knowing that there was one eventually on the horizon.
Mm.
And I felt like I was somewhat removed, right, during this happening. I wasn't working in that space anymore, but clearly some of the plans didn't seem to be followed, and things kind of seemed to fall apart there in the beginning. I'd like to think that we're back on course, and I hope that folks are getting vaccinated because it's something at GSK that was near and dear to my heart, not necessarily in COVID, but just vaccination in general, because it is a huge health advancement. It's a huge preventative measure when you get vaccinated for, a certain disease. It really protects you. And so it's a bit funny for me to be so removed during a pandemic because we've always talked about, what happens and how we would implement things. And certainly with H1N1, we started to go down that road thinking that was going to be the pandemic, but it didn't happen that way.
And were you surprised at how fast the vaccination was actually tested, you sort of prepared and well, formulated, then tested, and then released to the general public?
Yeah, yes and no. So, I mean, I think the mode that they had for that particular vaccine has been under development for a very, very long time.
Okay.
And they were able to slot in the particular antigen of COVID to make it work. And so they were so much further along than people really realize in development of the vaccine itself, even though it hadn't had that kind of COVID component to it. I think what was impressive, at least in the US, was just how many regulatory hurdles were worked through quickly, because you and I talked earlier about government and how slow things move in government. And it's just, it is what it is. There's so much regulation and so much that has to happen.
Yeah.
And I think regulators weren't willing to take the, the safety risk and skirt those things completely, which is understandable. So I'm not surprised that it got out as quick as it did, but I think it couldn't have been any quicker.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised it got out as fast as it did.
I was. Now I'm not an expert in this, but
Yeah,
just takes 10 years to usually test a
absolutely.
product. And I don't want to get into vaccine because
Right.
it's just an issue. It's like mostly in politics I stay clear of these days.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go into that as a conversation. But let's talk about your actual role at GSK. So it did evolve. You were there for 9 years, a substantial period of time, and you were influencing federal and state legislative policy. And it said here that you worked with a think tank. So was there a think tank that was involved?
Yeah. So I had numerous roles throughout my whole
Oh,
time there. A lot of my time was spent doing the messaging, preparing messaging, getting our lobbying teams ready to go up on the Hill, either in states or federally, and kind of coordinating what was happening across the US, mostly in vaccine policy. But then the longer I got there, the more issues I started to take on. And my last big role for GSK was the lead of think tank engagement. And so that was a really unique role for the company, in that I was kind of this liaison between our company and think tanks, and talking to them about issues, about what they were seeing happening on the federal level, giving them information about kind of where we firmly felt on things. And then they're often kind of taking that and educating back out into the kind of ecosystem and trying to build support for different things. But they're very kind of non-biased. So they take that information. If they don't like it, they're not going to use it. They're not going to. So it's a really interesting way of working with groups and getting a voice out there as well.
and coordinating, so the sort of the guys who are actually doing the lobbying, the persuading.
Right.
Did your role or approach to lobbying change when you were working for Pennsylvania Health System to GSK? I assume it got a little bit more sophisticated. You developed skills.
Yeah.
How did it change from your earlier days to when you were
Yeah.
in GSK?
Well, at Penn, I was really we were a small shop, so we did everything, like soup to nuts, like we did it all. So I had to write everything and then actually deliver it to the Hill myself and talk about it and build the relationships. And so it was in a lot of ways a big job. But at GSK, there were many more people. And so the greatest part about that is you can really get laser focused on your issue and really support it. But the other thing is we were a pharmaceutical company, so it's really super highly regulated, which means that every piece of content that I produce to give to a lawmaker has to get signed off by legal. And, I'm constantly going to the lawyer to make sure that this is okay, the way we're progressing. So there's just like a lot more kind of red tape to get things, moved along, where at Penn, I was really, very close to the top, to the CEO. My boss had a direct line into him all the time.
Yeah.
We could get things turned around in like a week, sign off on something.
Yeah, smaller, it happens in companies and startups as well. You're so much more agile. You're so much more, you can go into and change ideas very quickly. I worked in corporate well after my government years, and just I don't like actually calling it bureaucracy, because I like central government is bureaucracy. I always think corporates they're like large ships, they're like cruise liners. It takes them a long time to change their view or change their direction. Anyway, let's get into your current, or your company that you work for. So tell me about Authentic Influence Group. What is it? What do you do? And tell me about it.
Sure. So I primarily work in the pharmaceutical industry still. I work with pharma, medical device. Sometimes I work with other companies as well outside of those industries. So we go in and we train individuals to influence within their companies to kind of move up the corporate ladder. We sometimes do this in groups. Sometimes I do it one-on-one with folks as well. And then I also run a bit of a pilot program in which I kind of have a smaller number of individuals, usually from the same company, but not always. And then we work through the same things, but it's all about influencing and helping you to move up, because you can be the best person at your job and not move an inch because no one knows that you're the best person at your job, especially in those big cruise liners that you have to try to turn, right?
Absolutely. And I must admit, my corporate career really took off when I got a mentor, and he was a his starting roles was sales, and he was involved in sales quite a lot. And he said, what we're going to do is we're going to sell you, Mark. In your business, we are going to, and I actually think a lot of people would have turned away from that as an approach, but actually it really resonated with me, being able to sell yourself and influence people, persuade people that you are the best person for the promotion, for the job, whatever it was. So I really get that. I really get the sort of the role of persuasion, and in essence, it's a very similar things you're talking about, the lobbying, influencing government politicians. Now you're influencing corporate guys.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing. Like in my whole career, I started to see patterns of things that worked and kind of backdoor ways to influence. And you know, I was not always the most outgoing lobbyist. So I had other ways to get things done. And sometimes those are actually the ways that really work because it's not so over the top. And that's why I named my company Authentic Influence, because it really has to resonate with you, and you can't influence in a way that's not going to be you know, central to your core. If you try it, it just doesn't work.
So when I've been doing the research, a lot of things came up about non-verbal language and body language and using that as a skill. What do you think the role of body language or non-verbal means of communication within people? It doesn't have to be in people in business, but can be, depending on what your answer is.
Yeah, so it's funny. I think nonverbal is this thing that we are almost never taught, and yet it is so central to how you influence.
Yeah.
And so if you just sit there and, you know, put your hands under your on your chair and don't make any real contact with your face, right? No facial expressions. It's incredibly boring and no one's going to listen to you. And so nonverbals become like a superpower when you start to really learn how to use them. And now some people just naturally, you know, those sales people you talk about, they naturally learn those things as they move along in sales, but others have to really work at it. And certainly when you can start to read those nonverbals, you can understand a lot of what's happening in a room that isn't being communicated verbally.
And the interesting thing for me is, because I didn't do sales roles, when I was approached and we talked about this with my mentor about like non-verbal language and prompting people and influencing people. I actually thought I was better at it than perhaps the natural salesperson, because the natural salesperson, it's automatic that they're responding from instinct. Mine took maybe a little bit, half a second longer to decipher, but actually there was purpose, there was meaning behind those triggers that I was seeing in people's responses, and I was able to think through them rather than perhaps just that natural being able to respond very quickly.
Yeah, and I think you're right on there. I actually work with a lot of folks that are really introverted in the corporate space, and I find that they are so in tune with reading people because they're actually paying just a little bit more attention than someone who's extroverted, who's, you know, more worried about what they're going to say next than looking at what's coming from the other person.
Absolutely.
And so they actually can usually read the room better.
And the skill of actually listening to people. I've talked on solo podcasts, that sort of active listening approach is so powerful, so important in business.
It is, and it's one of those things again, like if we have a conversation, I might be sitting here thinking like, what am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? Instead of really just zoning in on what you're saying. And I think so people get so caught up in what they're putting out that they forget that there's another person on the other end,
Yeah.
and that it's really this communication happens between the two of us. It's not a one-way street. It shouldn't be. And so you really have to listen, right? And really process what that person is saying, right? Don't be thinking about what you're cooking for dinner that night or whatever. Like, what are they actually saying?
Is there a book that you know that would be a good starting point for my listeners to start with, to read, to think about this whole subject, non-verbal language, influence, persuasion? Is there anything that you would suggest for them to read or
Yeah,
listen?
sure. So there's a lot of resources out there. Vanessa Van Edwards has a book called Captivate. Joe Navarro is another body language person who was an FBI profiler. He has a book, I think it's called What the Body is Saying. And so those would be some great places to start as well. But there's lots of books on influence out there too.
Absolutely. How do you think communication, verbal and non-verbal, has evolved through the pandemic time? So we're now more used to Zoom now, but equally people are returning to the office and returning to networking events and things. How do you think that it's changed? The pandemic has changed this non-verbal and verbal communication.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Certainly on Zoom, like we are all used to Zoom and it now becomes an option. So if, you and I were going to meet for a cup of coffee, now all of a sudden there's an option to meet on Zoom, right? There is a little bit of intimacy, I think, in the Zoom calls because you're sitting really close to somebody if you think about it from just that positioning perspective. And you're really, if you have your camera on, you're looking at the person usually. And that makes a big difference, right? So if you're doing Zoom, you want to use that kind of open body language as well. So the person feels open and connected to you. Those folks going back in the office, the one thing that I've personally noticed is just, if you have a mask on, people are actually really zoning in on eye contact a lot more. People are really kind of talking with their eyes, if you will. And so that again is a kind of more intimate conversation in a lot of ways. So folks are connecting a little bit better and a little differently, although you also don't have like half of your face, right? Like we're not seeing that. So there's and certainly there's a lot of information that gets leaked out from your mouth, whether it's a smile or any other kind of cues. And if I can't see that, I might be able to sense that you're smiling, right? I see the creases in your eyes come up if you're really smiling. But some of that is missing. So it's just a really interesting and unique time. And I teach at Wharton persuasive speaking as well. And I'm finding my students are really nervous more than they have been to get up in front of other people. So I think there's a little bit of that as well. And even just if I meet someone, there's a little bit of a dance we do to see like, are we going to shake hands? Are we still comfortable giving a hug? Like, or is there nothing, you know? So that's a fun watch.
I find it absolutely hilarious. So I've decided if someone wants to shake my hand, I'll shake their hand. I'm fine with that now.
Right.
But I'm part of a networking group and we met for the first time on yesterday morning. And some people, it's really interesting, the number of people that were like, I don't know what to do. So I just shook their hand. You had people that were, yeah, I'm happy with it. Let's shake hands. And then there was one person specifically who I went to shake a hand. He went, no, I'm not. And that's fine. Like equally, that's absolutely fine. Like as if you know what you are comfortable with. So we did an elbow bump just to do it. But yeah, I think I think you're absolutely right about the mask thing as well, because what you do find is you are reading the creases of people's eyes. Are people smiling with their eyes? And actually smiling with your eyes is actually you have to accentuate it to make it clear. So I find the best way of getting that, but that whole essence of smiling to someone, whether you're talking to them like, oh, like this conversation, I'm enjoying the conversation, so it naturally I'm more smiling than frowning. So that's something that you lose, and part of persuasion and influencing people is by using triggers like smiles and things like that. So I do think that we're going through a sort of unusual phase for people to work out what the best way for them to persuade or influence people is. So that was a very long monologue on what I was trying to say. How much percentage do you think it is without a mask that is influencing someone with verbal versus non-verbal?
Oh boy, gosh, I don't know. So without a mask, so there are statistics that say like, upwards of there's, upwards of 60, 70, 80, 90, like depending on the study you look at. But those studies, I will say, are really about using like your total communication, right? Without a mask. So having your nonverbals out, but also how that links to verbals. So it's just a big game changer when you actually use those nonverbals as well to communicate, to kind of put a point on it. So even if I was giving a presentation today and I said something about this being like a global market and I put my hands out and make, the shape of a ball, like that's going to go over a lot easier in somebody's mind, because your visual learners can then catch right on to that as well.
I hope I'm not going to make you too self-conscious, but I've noticed while I was talking to you, your hand, you're very you're expressionful with your hands. You
Yeah.
talk of size and you said the globe and things like that. That's your authentic self, isn't it? That's what you do. Was that actually something you learn, or was that something that has always been natural for you?
Yeah, so that was actually learned for me. So, initially I was not really using my hands to talk with, and just slowly over time through learning nonverbal communication, I just realized how important it is, because it is our way of building trust with people. So if I had come on this podcast and I put my hands down on my lap the whole time and was talking to you like that, you would actually feel like, maybe there's something we're not connecting on. And you might not know why, but it's because you can't see my hands. And so that comes back to like when we were cavemen and we would be looking to see if somebody had a weapon in their hands. And while we don't look for that weapon anymore, we do look for trust. And so if I can see your hands, I know that I can trust you. And my mind subconsciously does that. So it's really important to use your hands when you talk.
And how do you think is the best way of making connection with people on Zoom?
So first of all, having the camera on, I feel like I shouldn't have to say that, but I can't tell you how many meetings I go into and folks decline to put the camera on. So that's number one. Number two is just, thinking about what is in your space, and is there anything that's going to distract the person on the other end, right? Are they going to be looking at your dog running back and forth rather than looking at you? And then having your hands out, pushing back enough that we can see your hands too. And another tip, which is not always easy, is to really look in the camera when you're talking, because that makes the person on the other end feel like they're talking right to you. Now it's tricky because obviously I want to look at you. I want to get like the nonverbal cues as well. So it's a little bit of a back and forth game over Zoom, but you do make the other person feel like you're talking right to them when you look in that camera.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've noticed, I tend not to look at the camera. I'm looking at the camera very deliberately, over exaggerating it, because the non-verbal cues for me to watch you, not I say what, like not like consciously, but my emphasis is making you feel comfortable.
Right.
You feel comfortable talking about yourself and your experiences and your expertise and stuff like that. And I think I can make a better job of what I'm doing as a podcast interviewer by actually seeing your cues. So a nod, an expression with the hands. Are you moving along with the conversation? I'm doing this with my hands for people who are on audio. So for me, I actually, although I see your point that the camera, looking into the camera, it's almost like eye contact.
Yes.
But for me personally, I think there's greater value for my role as a podcast interviewer, talking to someone about a subject and trying to influence them is slightly different, because you do want to have that eye contact with
Right.
someone. But my role in as an interviewer is really working like hard to actively listen
Right.
and view your body language. Are you sort of supporting what I'm saying? How are you responding to what I'm saying? So I think you're right, but I think it does depend on the role. I think as a facilitator, someone facilitating a group, like a group of
Yeah.
5 or 10 on a Zoom, it can be really hard to be able to connect people, and that's why having the grids in the corner so you can see everyone can be quite useful, because you
Right.
see someone that is rocked, or that you can see a some sort of response that they've got, and you can then bring them into the conversation. So I really think it does depend on your role on Zoom, on how you actually use that connection with the camera.
Yeah, it does, because that's the other thing. You can get a lot of information. Even, is somebody paying attention? If even if you're the facilitator, is somebody paying attention? Do I need to have folks take a break because they're just, they've had enough of this Zoom meeting? So it does, there's a trick between going back and forth. But the other thing that you might want to do is just record yourself on Zoom and try both ways and just see what it looks like on the other end. Or, next time you have a meeting, record it and take a look.
Yeah.
And it gives folks an idea of, what am I doing? Because sometimes we find when we record ourselves, we end up doing, nervous behaviors or something that we didn't even know we were doing.
Yeah, I've gone through, when I started my podcast and was recording, I never used to listen to it because there was a cringe factor. But
Right.
actually listening to it, you can tell everyone has sort of verbal tics, sort of things that they go to, like, or I suppose, or you know what I mean, or something like that. And actually listening back to yourself is a really powerful way of being, uh, for my role, is to become more eloquent and be a better interviewer, so I haven't got these constant verbal tics. So um how do you work those kinks out, as your role?
Yeah, so it's challenging. You absolutely have to work on those things, and I think you're right on the money there with watching or listening to yourself. That becomes really important, and it's so easy to just say, "Oh, I don't like myself on camera," or "I don't like the way I sound." But honestly, I'm sure you found, like, you've probably listened to yourself enough. You're like okay with it now, right?
Mhm.
So that's the important thing, and then just knowing that they're there becomes a step towards fixing that.
And these are all, I'm not saying they're not valuable. This is not rocket science. We used to
Right.
practice when we were doing like talks, or when I was doing my first sort of talk to a group of 100 people or something like that. The first time I did this, well, before I did podcasts, so I wasn't really prepared. You practice in the mirror, don't you? You look
Yeah.
at what sort of body language you're thinking, how you're going to respond, the tones, the pitches that you use. Do you go up? Do you go
Yeah.
down when you're talking? So some of these things are not necessarily new things. You're
Right.
just evolving it to modern technology, and Zoom being so prevalent because of the pandemic. You just need to practice and practice, getting used to yourself, getting used to your voice, your authentic voice, more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's right. Like it's not necessarily new things, but it's also things that I think as we progress in our career, we just get bits and pieces of it. And we never really take the time to really delve in a deep way and see, because those things make such a difference.
Mm.
If you go in a meeting and you're just not sounding confident and you're trying to put forward your project,
Yeah.
it can really tank your project. And so it's important to fix whatever those ticks are, or at least try
Mm.
to get them out as much as you can. I mean, I'm trained, ridiculous amounts in communication at this stage, and I still have things that I find I do from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and leadership. So I assume you work with leaders as well as people through. Um, how important is it for a leader to communicate? Because communication in a large company comes in many different varieties: email, talking face to face in groups, giving presentations. how do you find leaders are affected by working with you?
So it's interesting. A lot of my clients are about to make a move, or they're trying to, and they're kind of stuck. Like they're stuck between levels, and they come to me and they're like, I'm going for this role, but there's something not there. So they're usually really talented at what they do, and just incredible at what they do, but they can't seem to move. And they know that they're very aware that it has something to do with what they're putting out there, either their executive presence or their body language or their communication. So they know, they have an awareness that like just a little bit of work can get them over the edge. And so we do lots of work. I teach them a lot of body language. I teach them a lot of kind of visibility things in the workplace and how to be more visible. And usually soon after we work together, there's movement and they tick up to that next level.
Fantastic. This is not in my script, but I'm interested. How would you define, like, as a definition, influence or persuasion?
Yeah. So influence is affecting someone else to get something. So we are all influencing every day, whether you realize it or not, whether you have, you're the lowest person at the company or the highest person at the company, you are influencing in your everyday. And so it is really zoning in on how to do that and how to get those things that you need to either get the funding you need for a project, to get, the role that you want, or to get, your kids to make their lunch the next day. It's all influence.
Yeah. The influence of your children is a slightly, I find it's a slightly different
Well, that is example.
approach to influence compared to your boss or a client. But I get your point. As you say, you're influencing family members, you're
Yeah,
influencing friends all the time, even to the point of where do you want to go tonight.
right.
Some people are more dominant, some people are more subservient, but I think if people understood that it is actually part of every day, you influence people every day, I think it would be a lot better for people to realize that. Right. Next 2 to 5 years, what's the plan for you?
Next 2 to 5 years. So I'm continuing to work on this program that's in pharma. So I hope to roll it out to more companies. I also hope there's a book in my future within the next 2 to 5 years. And I guess that's where I'm focused now.
What's the I know it's going to be about influence and
Right.
but like, what do you have a sort of do you have an idea what the book's going to be about?
Yeah, so influence tactics and how to influence in that corporate space as well, probably be geared right toward the market that I work in, which is healthcare and pharma.
Yeah.
And so how to move that. Healthcare is an interesting beast, and it's a little bit different in some ways, a little bit more churn in the pharma industry as well. So it's a little bit of a different animal in that.
And all your roles, do you get global clients or do you get mainly in the US?
I do sometimes during the pandemic, I certainly have gotten some global clients, and obviously we're working on Zoom. So that's opened up some business as well.
Excellent. All right. So we're coming to the end of the interview. I ask the same 6 questions to all of my guests. They're quick fire questions. They don't need a quick fire answer. It's up to you. The first one is, what's the best decision that you made?
Oh, the best decision that I made was to, I think it was to apply to an internship, a fellowship way early when I was in college, because it got me on this path of thinking about politics and working in politics. And eventually, it just all flowed into kind of where I am today.
Awesome. What's the best piece of advice you were given?
To ask, why not? Why not me? Right? I want to open a business. Why not me?
It's really interesting. There's something that Tim Ferriss does, and I'm going to completely butcher it, unfortunately. But it's the question. It's kind of like why not is. Yeah, I think it's not why not, but essentially it's like asking, when you're thinking about something,
Right.
shall I do this or shall I do that? Well, why not do that? And then you go, well, because I was thinking about, so why not do that? And ask that question repeatedly until you get to the real core reason, which is usually emotionally driven, not cognitively driven, to why shouldn't you start that business? Why shouldn't you go for that promotion? Why shouldn't you do that? And I think it's a really good technique, and everyone who's listening should try thinking about that. Maybe look it up on Tim Ferriss's website on how he describes it, because I have completely butchered it. But that approach of just asking that repeated question, you get to the core of what you actually want, rather than disguising what you really feel with cognition. You actually get to the drill down to the bottom. So I totally get that. I like that. You can do a shout out to a few, but who's the person that helped you most in your career?
Oh, wow. So, gosh, there was a gentleman, Leon Rudy, he's since passed away, unfortunately. He was an early supporter of mine and just always cheering me on from the sidelines. So Leon would definitely be somebody who I would give a shout out to. Um, Elizabeth Seifert, who was somebody at GlaxoSmithKline, who was just always a strong supporter of mine. And, there's just been so many folks, certainly from my graduate program, Dr. Mulhern. Yeah, there's just lots of folks that have helped me along the way. And I think that that's the most important thing, is to help others along the way too, and kind of reach your hand back and help pull somebody else up with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have any regrets?
Oh gosh, lots of regrets. But they all focus really on, early in my career, just not taking the chances. So, and waiting until I was like further down the road to take some real chances. So I think that would be why those regrets are there, because I didn't ask why not me. I just, took the, oh, I can't do that kind of approach.
That's really interesting. So I in my younger years, I had opportunities and didn't take them. And on reflection upon it, yes, I regret some of them and wish I had progressed in various ways. But it's more of a problem when you don't get opportunities, rather than you get opportunities and you don't take them. So I always tell, because I do some coaching as well, and I always say to people, and they're like, well, I could have done this, but it didn't quite work out. I wasn't confident enough to go for it, or something like that. If you just focus on seeing the opportunities, assessing the opportunities, and then take them if you want them, I've found has been really, really powerful. And yeah, I thank you for your honesty about regrets, because a lot of people on here sort of cop out and say, oh, that's harsh. It's harsh, but essentially say, well, I am who I am because of all of the choices I made. I
Right.
wouldn't change myself. And I do get that,
Right.
because you are just the sum of the opportunities and that you took and things. But there's got to be something that you wish you'd have taken or gone,
Right.
or took that flight, or met that person, or whatever it is. So yeah, I thank you for your candor about that, because it is important. Because yes, you are some of all your decisions, but there's got to be something that you wish you'd have,
Yeah,
make that telephone call, or took that flight,
exactly.
or met that person. So it is
Definitely.
important. What are you most proud of?
I'm most proud of my business that I've built. As you know, it's not easy building a business, and um, didn't really know how to do it, and just kept persevering through it. And as you know, there's lots of ups and downs, especially early.
Mm.
And so I'm really happy at where it is now, and that I've been able to get to that place.
Was there ever a moment where you nearly quit and went back to a corporate job?
Um, Not exactly. So there have been moments where I've thought about it, and I've really thought, "Oh, should I really be out here like doing this? Like when is it gonna happen?" But I think one of my superpowers is perseverance. So I can persevere through almost anything. Um, and so I always just felt like it's still gonna be there. And my brother owns a business too. He's a photographer, and he would keep telling me, just give it a little more time, just give it a little more time, give it a little more time. And so that helped keep me on course.
support network as an entrepreneur is so important.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be underestimated by people. Having someone, well, yeah, having people that are cheering you on and sort of supporting you is really,
Yeah.
really important. And I'm glad you've got someone that's sort of cheering you on. And actually, it sounds like your brother is actually quite knowledgeable, because you can be so close to actually cracking the nut.
Right.
And often people pivot or change or adapt and don't and yeah, it's like that question that gets asked, like, like, when you keep on trying, when do you know is the time to actually quit and
Right.
try something new, or keep on persevering on what your approach was? I think that's a really, really interesting thought process to go through, because I think everyone who started a business has gone through that point where they're like,
Yeah.
maybe this isn't going to work. I have, like, whatever, can I pay the rent or whatever?
Right.
What drove you on? You said persistence and sort of perseverance on moving, on keep on moving the chains, but do you, what kept you? Was it I'm not going to fail, or was it more people are telling me I can't do it, I'm just gonna prove them wrong? What was it that kept you going?
Yeah, I don't know. I think somewhere along the way, I just became really, really driven by kind of the mission. And one of the core groups I work with a lot are women in pharma, and they sometimes have a tougher road. And so, hearing some really, you know, heart-wrenching stories about what have happened to folks in the corporate world, and even some of the men that I work with too, and just feeling like that's not right. Like if they had only had these tools,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And so feeling like I could support them in that way and help to raise them up, just, continues to kind of light my path forward.
fantastic. What does legacy mean to you?
A legacy would mean, for my business, I think it would mean just, kind of cracking that nut in some way, like um, having folks influencing out there and being able to move in their careers and really being able to do what they need to do at the core, but helping them to do that as well.
Fantastic. And lastly, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
So the best place to find me is on LinkedIn because I put out a lot of videos. So it's Shelly O'Donovan, and then you can find me on my website as well at authenticinfluencegroup.com.
Thank you very much, Shelley. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks.